Hello everyone, welcome or welcome back. My name is Jessa and today's video is going to be a reading wrap up for the months of January and February. To start, I'll briefly talk about the graphic novels and one short story. So the first one called Home Office Romance, which basically follows these two characters who are like neighbors during the pandemic who fall in love. I give this one I think 4.5 stars. The second one that I read was a book called Fall in Love, You False Angels. First volume of manga series following these goody two-shoes perfectionists at their high school who quickly discover that both of them have these like more hidden, darker sides. So I did really enjoy this one. The art in it is really lovely. And the next one that I read was The Conjurer's Wife, which is a short story by Sarah Penner, who also wrote novel The Lost Apothecary. Actually read The Lost Apothecary back in 2020 and I wasn't a really big fan of it. I didn't really like some of the narrative choices. Actually, some of her other books have intrigued me. Maybe I'll check this out and see if her writing style has improved, and personally I did not think that there was much improvement. The other graphic novel that I read, called The Curse of Monte Cristo, is a graphic novel reimagining more so of the Count of Monte Cristo. Reimagines Edmond Dantes as a escaped Haitian slave. It's actually set during the Haitian Revolution as opposed to during the Bourbon Restoration in France. I think it actually worked well to talk about different themes, particularly the theme of slavery, which was actually a big inspiration behind Dumas's writing of the Count of Monte Cristo because his father was actually someone who escaped from slavery. I did really enjoy this one. However, I think some of the narrative elements weren't as strong, mainly because of the length, because the Count of Monte Cristo is a humongous book. I have actually read the Count of Monte Cristo, however it was an abridged version during high school French class. Even that like abridged version had more depth than this graphic novel did. Do you think overall that it is a good one that I would recommend checking out? And then the last was the Ayakashi Hunter's Tainted Bride, which was also a first volume in a manga series set in this world that is sort of inspired by feudal Japan, where there are demons called Ayakashi, and there are also these families that are Ayakashi hunters, and we follow this main character who was attacked by one of these Ayakashi when she was younger, and as a result has been deemed tainted, ostracized by her clan. And then there is this important man who is the head of the like top ranked family, and he comes to her clan searching for a bride, and basically he senses that she has this high spiritual energy, so he ends up taking her as his bride. Overall, really enjoyed this one. Now for the other books, I'm just gonna start doing them in chronological order. First one that I read was Dungeons and Drama by Christy Boyce. So I read this one as an audiobook and I really enjoyed it. It's a really fun sort of like contemporary romance following these two characters who are sort of drawn together by unlikely circumstances. Our main female character, Riley, is forced to work at her father's game store, and there she meets Nathan, an employee there, and he is sort of this nerdy boy who loves all things about games, in particular Dungeons and Dragons, which is sort of what the title is referencing. Riley is also a musical theater geek, and then the school musical gets shut down and she has to like go on this whole quest to like save the school musical while also working at the job, and also ends up fake dating Nathan. So it's really fun, and I really liked how like unapologetically nerdy this book was, and I liked both of the main characters and thought that it explored a lot of themes that could be beneficial for teenagers, of like relationships and dealing with parents. Her parents are divorced. I thought that was really well done, and overall really enjoyed this one. The next book I read was Legends and Librarians, a cozy fantasy with a romance plot line that follows this character who takes up a job at a local library that she used to go to when she was a child that has become overrun by book spirits. So they are a manifestation of like characters from books that have sort of taken over this library now that it's been abandoned. So we follow this main character as she is trying to rebuild the library alongside this member from the Adventurers Guild who is sort of like forced to help her and keep her safe because, you know, the library is haunted. It is like part like ghost hunting, part like cozy fantasy, part romance. There's like a love of books. Like the magic system is highly based around books. So this one was really interesting and fun, and I think in particular if you like anything in that cozy fantasy, this would be a great one to pick up. The The next one that I have is Five Broken Blades by Mai Corlin. This is another one that I really loved. This is a Korean-inspired fantasy with some romance on the side. It is in Entangled Publishing, which is the same company that has done Fourth Wing, so it's like another special edition kind of. So this one, basically we followed 6 different characters who are split into 3 different pairs who are all teaming up on this mission to assassinate the cruel tyrannical king. Because our characters are split off into 3 separate pairs, there is romance that develops between all 3 of these pairings. And I actually think that this was really well done, because for the first half of this book we got to sort of be with those pairings and got to know the characters on a more intimate level by having interact with one another before they're all interacting with the whole ensemble cast, so we got to see those stronger connections be built. So overall, I thought that was really well done. I think there's a lot of really interesting elements at play in the story, and I really liked the Korean inspiration. So I'm excited to continue with this series. The next one that I read was an audiobook. It was the Ornithologist Field Guide to Love. It's also a bit like a cozy fantasy, but I wouldn't fully characterize it as a cozy fantasy because it has a bit more of like a central plot line going on. It follows these 2 characters who are rival ornithologists, who are people who study birds, and it is set in this world where there are magical birds. If you have read the Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies series, I would recommend this book as well. I feel like this one is more romance heavy than Emily Wilde. There were some times where I was maybe a bit frustrated with the fact that the characters, who are like all full-grown adults, could not communicate certain emotions and feelings towards one another. They're actually like competing in this competition against each other. We sort of get to see the behind the scenes of the people behind the competition, and it's made very clear that the competition is actually just farce and they're just doing it so that more people want to become ornithologists. So there was a lot of funny elements going on there. I think also the second book in this series came out this year as well. I think it's called The Geographer's Map to Love or something like that. The next one I have is a very popular one, Iron Flame. I have a love-hate relationship with the Fourth Wing series. I read Fourth Wing immediately after it came out. I was really excited for it, and this was actually before the whole big hype around it started happening. I feel like the hype took a couple of weeks to get going. I did like Fourth Wing and I had a good time with it, but I'm not as invested in this series as I think a lot of other people are. I almost did the exact same thing of picking it up immediately. However, when I had started it, I could not make it past the first chapter. I do not know what is up with that, but the first chapter in this book is one of the worst first chapters I think I've ever read in my entire life. Luckily, that didn't happen for every single chapter, but there were definitely some parts of this book where I felt the same way. I have mixed feelings on this series, and I was reading this one in anticipation for Onyx Storm, but it's going to be a while before the next book comes out, which I don't fault Rebecca Yarros for at all. I think authors should take as much time as they need to put out their books, and I actually think that that is part of the reason why the Fourth Wing series has sort of tailed off from the first one, is because she was being rushed for both Iron Flame and Onyx Storm. So the next one was also an audiobook that I read, and it was Where the Library Hides. I have this Fairy Loot edition of What the River Knows, which is the first book. I actually quite enjoyed this first one. I didn't love it, and I do kind of regret getting this edition because I bought this edition before I had read it. I just wasn't a huge fan of it. I think it's sort of like pitched as being like the movie The Mummy, and I really liked that movie. I watched it when I was a kid and always been someone who's liked history and mythology and stuff like that. It's about like Egyptian mythology and finding these magical artifacts. I was like, oh, those all sound like good things, but I feel like the execution was a bit off. I feel like that continued in Where the Library Hides and actually brought out more bad elements than it did good elements. I think that this one was better. I personally was not a fan of the development of the romance and the development of the 2 main characters. Felt like Wit, who was our male character, his character, in my opinion, was completely tanked. I also think there was a couple of like plot things that were just like a bit too convenient. Plot twists that happened in both the first and second book that very generic in terms of, so it was very predictable and just overall really lackluster for a story that I think had a lot of unique and cool elements going for it, and also a lot of hype around it as well. general had people really excited for it, so I think it was a bit of a disappointment on my end. The next book that I have is one that I was sort of like reading on and off between January and February, and it is actually a nonfiction book, and it is Unmasking Autism by Dr. Devin Price. So I am currently in the process of trying to pursue an autism diagnosis, so I wanted to pick up this book to sort of learn more about autism. I think this one overall is a pretty good source, and I did find some like useful about this, and I think this source would be really beneficial for really anyone who is just trying to learn more about autism. But I do feel like it is a bit too surface level at times, and something that I struggled with, this is maybe getting a bit personal, felt like a lot of the information in this book is more so directed at unmasking autism in the public sphere as opposed to unmasking autism as an individual. That is something that I kind of struggle with, because a lot of tips how to unmask around other people, how to approach talking to friends about these things, and as someone who, a big reason why they suspect that they are autistic is because of their struggles communicating and interacting with people socially, and as a result doesn't really have any of those friendship connections. It kind of felt a bit off. For me, learning to unmask autism is something that has to be personal and internal. It has to first apply to like me and my daily life and who I am as a person, as opposed to the way that other people are interacting with me, because that is like a big thing about masking in general, is that you put up this mask to pretend that you are someone else so that other people are more accepting of you. And so I felt like some of the elements of unmasking autism were actually just how to mask autism in a way that doesn't ruin your mental health, which is still beneficial. At large, it's not tackling the main issue autistic people are forced to mask in general. And I think everyone to a certain extent is forced to mask. There is a lot of pressure to keep the struggles that you have hidden. And I think that it is actually better to be unapologetic about talking about these things, irregardless of whether or not they make other people uncomfortable. So I would have liked to have more information on how to unmask as an individual, as opposed to unmasking as an individual who operates in a society that does not want you or does not accept you and is never going to accept you. I hope that things will change, and I hope that, the conversation is changing, and I do think that books like this are actually helping to change that conversation by like discussing autism, something that is approachable and easy for people. And I think just having Dr. Devin Price is someone with a PhD who is working in the psychiatric fields as a person with autism, and so I think indicative of change that is coming, but there was still some elements that actually made me feel a bit more alienated about autistic traits, about myself, rather than accepted. I also read A Rivalry of Hearts by Toussaint Odette. So this is a very fun fantasy romance book that follows these two rival authors who are put against each other on this like book tour to battle it out for a book deal with their publisher. We follow this character. She is a human, and she basically writes spicy fairy romance books. These end up appealing a lot to the Fae audience that she doesn't have access to because she lives on the human continent as opposed to the Fae continent. So she arrives on the Fae continent to do this whole book tour, hordes of fans that she like never knew even exist. When she arrives there, she was also met with a rival. His name is William, and he's a poet. He very much sort of like looks down on her. There is this fun like rival dynamic between the two of them. I just felt like I just loved the dynamic between these characters. Her name is Edwina, his name is William, and at one point they have nicknames for each other, which are Willie and Weenie. So I feel like that really emphasizes just like the tone that this book has, which is like that it does not take itself seriously at all. I think really fun, and I had a great time with it. Second book in the series also has come out, so I'm also really excited for that one as well. The next book that I read is a memoir, and it is actually the like follow-up to another one that was a bit more popular, and it's called I Want to Die But I Still Want to Eat Tteokbokki. Both of them have been written by a South Korean author who is chronicling her sort of conversations with her therapist, mainly dealing with anxiety and depression. There's also a lot of talk about suicide, self-harm, eating disorders, so there are a lot of like trigger warnings for this book in general, but I still think that it is a interesting exploration of mental health and push and and pull dynamic that a lot of people experience when seeking help and just in general living with mental health conditions, because in the first book, it sort of ends on this more happy note. She's doing a lot better in her job, is writing this book, and is set to publish it. Having this follow-up where all of those things that were going right for her start going wrong again, and even when things are going right, that she's still struggling with those same mental health issues, I think it was beneficial for me to see. I think a lot of people have this idea that going to therapy or getting help for mental health conditions will solve all of your problems in the world, when in reality it does not, and it's always going to be this constant like push and pull dynamic that is forever going to inform your life. And I really enjoyed this one. It does have a lot of those more heavier topic discussions going on, but I would still recommend it if you are someone who is looking to learn more about mental health issues. I do think a bit of a qualifier maybe that this is written by a woman living in South Korea. If you are familiar with the culture there, is a lot less open about talking about women's issues and mental health issues than here in the West, I would personally say. It might not go as in depth into some of the themes, and there's also a lot of talk from the author about her internalization of shame. She talks a lot about like her body image issues, and that's mainly because of the very strict standards in Korea. While we do have very strict standards here in the West, I think there is still more fluidity than what there is in South Korea. Author who is writing this is still someone who is struggling to deal with those issues and struggling to deal with the sort of standards that she has internalized, which I think many of us as well are. The next book that I read is Check and Mate by Ali Hazelwood. I love Ali Hazelwood's books. I have read almost all of them now. I actually have another one of her books that is in this stack here. Check and Mate very sadly happens to be one of my least favorites. First thing is that this is not a YA book. I do not know why this is marketed as YA. The characters in this are actually not even in the YA range that I would classify, because our main character Mallory is 19 and I believe Nolan, whose main male character, is 20. I would not classify this as YA, and in my opinion talks way too much about sexual content for it to be acceptable for a YA audience. My second criticism towards it is that I don't really feel like there was a lot of romance in this in general. I think you don't even meet Nolan until over 100 pages, so it doesn't really feel as equal as some of Ali Hazelwood's other books, because in those ones we're meeting both of the characters pretty early on, and even though we follow the female character more, I still feel like the other male characters have gotten a lot more depth in their characters than Nolan did, and that might have been something why it was classed as YA, is that it went less into some of those deeper themes. But I think in contrast to a book like Dungeons and Drama that I talked about earlier, I think that one went further into sort of complex themes and still did so in a way that is appropriate for a YA audience, while also presenting a like fun and compelling romance, whereas I feel like this one sadly did not do so. I do think that there was some like good elements of it. I did like the discussion about chess, sort of the ways that women have been mistreated within that field. Honestly, there is like absolutely no reason why chess or any sort of game like that should be gender segregated, and so I was kind of hoping that this would go more into those sort of themes about gender and misogyny with the chess community, and that was actually like a big inspiration why Ali Hazelwood wrote this book in general. But I feel like in comparison to her other books, in particular one like Love on the Brain, that she could have gone deeper into those themes. Also, on a side note, the Dragon Age references in this kind of pissed me off. I really love the Dragon Age franchise, and the fact that all of references to Dragon Age were all very obviously about Solas kind of made me angry. And I get that like Solas is, the girlies love him, like he is Dragon Age's Kylo Ren, because you know Ali Hazelwood also loves Kylo Ren. There's so much more to Dragon Age than just Solas, and it was also like, oh, we watched the latest Dragon Age playthrough. I'm like, girly, this book was written in 2022. Was anyone really posting new Dragon Age playthroughs in 2022? I really don't feel like there was much of a Dragon Age Inquisition community. That kind of like bothered me a little bit. I'm just being ridiculous at this point, but you know, If you are also a Dragon Age fan, leave a comment below. And sort of similar to Check and Mate, I actually picked up another book that was highly recommended by Ali Hazelwood, and that was A Hunger Like No Other by Presley Cole. It is the first book in the Immortals After Dark series. Early 2000s, super long paranormal romance series. I did not like this one. I don't feel like that's like a hot topic opinion at all, because literally within the first like 2 chapters, our main character is kidnapped by the main male character. It kind of just gets worse from there, because he is basically like a werewolf and he has been in prison for like centuries. And then this girl, who is allegedly his mate, arrives in the country that he is in. And the scent of her brings him like back out of this like slumber that he's been in for thousands of years. I feel like it's like the alpha hole from the Sarah J Maas universe, like brought up to like 100. And I'm honestly angry at Ali Hazelwood for recommending this book, because what do you mean? Like, Bride was so much better than this. A lot of like non-consensual things happening in this book. Internally we can kind of see that she's like, oh, I sort of like these things, but she's not like certain about things, and he's not like listening to what she has to say. And also on top of this, oh my gosh, I can't believe that it's taking me so long to mention this, but he is like Scottish, and he's written with a Scottish accent in this book, and my brain was just like, oh, so he's Shrek. I don't know, I don't mind when like accents are like audio book and whatever, but I don't like reading the accents. I can understand that they're there, but I don't like having to read it. It kind of like breaks the immersion there. So that was another thing that kind of bothered me about this. I also think this cover is a bit deceiving. If you can kind of see it, like, this guy looks young. He's not young too, and she is a bit younger. Sort of on the topic of like age, I felt like the main character was being very much like infantilized in terms of what experiences she's had in her life. Also by the main male character, who is perceiving her in a sexual way from the beginning, is seeing her almost only in a sexual way. Personally, this one was not for me. The next book that I read was also another one that I also have mixed feelings about, called Blood, Iron, and Bone by an author duo, Sarah Fox. The main issue that I had, it follows a lot of different POV characters, and that wasn't mentioned in the synopsis. The synopsis actually just mentions that there is this main character. Her name is Aurelia, and she is from sort of our human world, and she has these dreams that connect her to this Fae realm. In these dreams, she is connected to this one Fae male. But the story doesn't really follow that plotline at all. Get introduced to these other characters really early on. One of them is the princess of this Fae land, engaged to the boy that Aurelia is seeing, a human who was kidnapped by the fairies and then forced to become a servant. Sort of these interesting elements in terms of like the world and sort of playing with the sort of mythos around the fairy changelings. Nothing really happens in the first section of it. We're told about this main character who lives in the human world and that she has this connection. However, she doesn't actually get there until like over halfway through the book, and so we're just following her, living her daily life in her boring human world. But I do think some of the world building elements were really interesting. There's sort of like these different types of Fae, and the main sort of Fae have the ability to like shapeshift. I felt like this one needed to be edited a lot more, and probably could have been condensed, because it was like almost like 500 pages and nothing happens within the first like 50%. But I do think there was some interesting elements, and I actually think that sort of what it was pitched as is following these two main characters who were like connected through the realm. That was the most boring aspect of the book. The next book I had is another audiobook, and it was called The Truth According to Ember by Danica Neva. Contemporary romance that follows this character named Ember, who is sort of like an all-around disaster. Ember is sort of like struggling to find sort of her place in the world and find a place where she can belong. And so what she decides to do is actually write a resume where she not only lies about her job experience, but also decides to leave out the fact that she is Native. This in particular was inspired by the author's own experience with discrimination in the workforce and in trying to find employment, and just in general the way that people have treated her as a result of being Native. I think it's really important to have this sort of representation in books that aren't, you know, nonfiction books. I feel like there are a lot of nonfiction books written about about from the perspective of Indigenous people in Canada and Native people in the United States. And while sources are important as well, I think that it's also important to have that representation within fiction books, because if, you know, our romance books only feature white protagonists, then we sort of normalize that all romance books or all romance movies or all romance media in general should only follow white characters. So having this book that follows two Indigenous characters, I think is really important, and I liked how she went about exploring those themes, in both in terms of exploring the discriminations that come with those and issues that they face, but also exploring the beauty of their culture. Like, one thing that I really liked was there is a lot of descriptions about how beautiful the scenery is that I think were just so impactful coming from an Indigenous author. Indigenous people view themselves as being guardians and caretakers of the land, so seeing the way that Ember talked about the land and how beautiful and lovely it was, I think a really eye-opening thing, because I live in Canada and I tend to look at, you know, the world around me and think that it looks very boring, especially someone who has been to places in Europe. So I never really thought of my own home here in Canada being beautiful, because our standards of what is an aesthetically pleasing city are sort of based around these more Eurocentric ideas. Our main character has very long hair, which is also very significant in Indigenous cultures. So I really like those explorations of themes. Ember as a whole, I feel like, is sort of representative of this, you know, younger generation that doesn't really know how to fit in and how to make their way through the workplace, and I feel like that was really emphasized through her struggles. I did think some of the choices that she made were pretty dumb, and this sort of compulsion to like always lie, which did get on my nerves a little bit, especially when she was lying to the love interest. Overall, I still enjoyed this book, and once again, I think it's really positive for representation, and I think Danica Neva is coming out with another book this year that is a romance between a country singer and horseback rider or bull rider, so it's sort of cowboy romance, but both of the characters are also native in that one as well. I'm really interested in checking that one out because I know the girlies love cowboy romance, and I think that bringing forth some diversity within that genre, like, positive step in the right direction. Another one that I checked out was Greenteeth by Molly O'Neill. So this one I pitched as like a cozy fantasy, and I personally think that that characterization is wrong. More of like a quest adventure fantasy, I think. Some of the comp titles for this, like T. Kingfisher's books, and I think in particular it's quite similar to something like Nettle and Bone, where there's sort of this quest element, and I personally wouldn't characterize Nettle and Bone as being a cozy fantasy, because there is this more overarching plot that is really serious, and there are some sort of like horror elements, and I would say that the same is present for Greenteeth. This more overarching plot line, basically following these three characters. The first one is Jenny Greenteeth, who is inspired by the sort of mythology around Jenny Greenteeth, a character in English folklore, and basically Jenny has saved this woman thrown into the bog, and she basically saves her from this bog, and afterwards they find out that like mythical evil figure has taken root within town that the woman is from, and there's also this goblin character that sort of helps them. So these three set out on this adventure to sort of like take down the big bad evil in the small town. I felt like there were good elements about it. I think because it's pitched as a cozy fantasy, what I sort of look for in cozy fantasies is good character, because there isn't much of a plot line, so you have to have something about it that's compelling, which has to be the characters, and I feel like Greenteeth does not make you care about the characters at all. What this story could have benefited from was having the multiple point of views from the characters, because we're just following Jenny's character, and I felt like having her perspective would have added to this, because she is actually the only one who has any sort of investment in trying to save the town, because her family still lives there, whereas Jenny and I think Barkus is the goblin. Barkus is the gnome from Baldur's Gate 3. Neither of those two characters have any sort of connection to the village. We don't get to actually see the sort of like internal process of the character who's actually invested in what's happening. Overall, my experience with this book was rather negative. I still think it could appeal to some people. I think if you are someone who really enjoyed Nettle and Bone, the book might appeal to you. Alright, so my camera battery died, so if the angle at all changed, that is why, so sorry about that. But the next book that I read is another nonfiction book. This was an audiobook that that I listened to, and it's called The House of My Mother by Sherry Frank. Sherry Frankie is the daughter of Ruby Frankie, who ran this channel called 8 Passengers, and her YouTube channel was later shut down. I believe it was in 2023, and also later in that year she was arrested on charges of child abuse. Memoir does talk a lot about topics like child abuse and other forms of abuse and manipulation, so it is a very heavy, very well done discussion of these themes. It is a memoir that comes from Sherry talking about her own story and her own experience, which I think is something that is really important, mainly because of how she has been exploited in the past, and she actually makes a very big point about not using the names of her younger siblings who were the people most affected by her mother's abuse, and I think that was really admirable of her and really shows like her character, what she wanted to do with this book. Part of what Sherry talks about in this memoir is actually the importance of memoir and importance of being a witness to sort of the events that have happened to her. So I think the fact that this is written by her, it's also narrated by her as the audiobook narrator, was really important and impactful towards the messaging of this story, which is around reclaiming the narrative around your own life, which is something that a lot of people who have experienced trauma struggle with. So I think this is a really good, not just book in terms of talking about those things, but a good example about what it feels like to be someone who has been abused, how people can deal with and cope with these things. It does go into detail about instances of child abuse. It also talks a lot about her experience in religion. A lot of people have not been as understanding about, because she is Mormon and was raised in that community, and I actually liked the discussion about her religion work. She actually talks about how testimonial work is something that is really important within Mormonism at large, and how it inspires a lot of people to become family vloggers, and that taught me things that I didn't really know about connections between faith and family vlogging, because I think we see a lot of these discussions about family vloggers and fundamental values, and how Sherry talked about how, you know, Mormonism and her faith has actually had some positive impacts on her life. So I thought that discussion and having it be more nuanced was really important, as well as when she's also talking about her mother and also her father, she approaches talking about both of them with a lot of empathy for their situations, which I think is really sort of indicative of the way that a lot of people who have grown up in abusive households rationalize things. From my own personal experience, is that, you know, when you're living with a parent who, you know, abusive behaviors or tendencies, you sort of try and rationalize those behaviors so that you can avoid outlash from it. But I was intrigued by Sherry sort of not directly mentioning that, but sort of indirectly showing how that mentality sort of continues, how it's lived through those experiences throughout their life, that we, you know, when someone hurts us, you know, our first instinct is not to defend ourselves, but to justify why that person would be hurting us or saying these mean things, because that's, you know, what the tool that we sort of needed to be able to survive. And I think in the moment of when it happens, it is very harmful, but I do think, as someone who personally goes through this, that it is something that helps me to be more empathetic to other people, and I feel like that came through in Sherry's memoir as well. That, you know, despite all of the terrible things that her mother did and things that her father sort of let happen, it doesn't justify it in any way, but it does sort of explain, you know, like why people continue to tolerate and accept abuse, because if you're taught that as a child, that becomes what you end up perpetrating. So a lot of people will show that trauma is a cycle that is endlessly repeating itself, and I think that this memoir does a really good job at trying to break away from that cycle by actually showing Sherry as she's trying to work against it, but is also trying to work against it in a way that is productive towards her own mental and physical well-being. I really enjoyed this one, and I'd love to see Sherry write more. I think that she has, you know, a great platform and a great voice to be able to talk about these issues, and I'm really grateful that she took the time and had the courage to share her own story. Also to do so in a manner that's informative, because it's not aimed at being an expose of everything that happened. It's aimed at being, the title of it is A Daughter's Quest for Freedom. It's about her own story on a bit bit of a lighter note from that last one, Heart of the Sun Warrior. So this is the second book in the Celestial Kingdom duology by Su Lin Tan. The first one is called Daughter of the Moon Goddess, but this is the second one. It basically picks off about a year after the first book, returning to follow our main character Jin Yin. Some of the threats that were not dealt with in the first book end up coming back. I did enjoy the story, and I thought some of the themes that it discusses were really poignant. One of them in particular was the theme of grief, and I thought that Su Lin Tan did a really good job at exploring those themes. However, this is a book that is well known for its flowery and beautiful writing style, and I sometimes felt like the flowery, beautiful writing style sort of detract away from some of the theme. She's writing these things for the sake of writing it in a beautiful way instead of actually saying something with the words. Kind of just felt like she was going through a thesaurus and picking out the nicest, most melodic sounding words as opposed to, writing from the heart. Another aspect is that the first book had this love triangle element, and I kind of felt like the love triangle was done, and it was not done. Personally, I was not the biggest fan of the way that it ended. I actually liked the other love interest more and thought that she should have ended up with that character, even though in the first book I was on the opposite end. The next book I read, Hunger by Roxane Gay. So this is a memoir that is sort of pitched as a memoir of my body, discussion around body image. She sort of explains it as her experience as being a fat person. I think that there is a lot of really interesting discussion in this book, and sort of similar to some of the other nonfiction that I mentioned. The topics in this are very, very heavy. She sort of begins by talking about how negative experiences with body image has come about as a result of being sexually assaulted, and how food and eating used as a coping mechanism to sort of protect herself from further abuse. I think really informative about what it's like both live with trauma and also to have trauma, which is internal, become something that is external. And I think there is in media a lot of vilification for fat people and just anyone who does not fit into the standard of what is a perfect body, or anyone who has what's called a deviant body, as some disabled and body positive activist communities will call it. I think it's sort of sad because more people were willing to help her with her external issues than her internal issues, and I think that sort of relates back to a lot of the discussions that Sherry brought up in her memoir as well, is that people are really ignorant to suffering that they cannot see. What we see is that people don't really care about someone's mental health issues or mental health struggles until they start to affect other people. And that was sort of some of the issues that I was also talking about the Unmasking Autism book by Dr. Devin Price, is that the discussion in that book was focused on how to unmask autism around other people without sort of keeping in mind the fact that you might struggle to unmask autism just around yourself and just as a person in general, and how I personally think that needs to come first before you can start unmasking around other people. I think that Hunger sort of explores those similar issues about the internal and external effects of mental health. The next book I read was Archangel's Kiss by Nalini Singh. So this was a audiobook that I listened to. Overall, I quite enjoyed this one. I did not like it as much as the first one, following this vampire hunter named Elena, who is recruited by the Archangel of New York to this rogue archangel threatening everyone because the archangels are super powerful. So some other vampire things going on. And in this world, the vampires are actually made by angels. However, the book is actually more focused on the romance between Elena and Raphael, which in of itself isn't bad. I actually did enjoy their dynamic. There's just some aspects of it that were a bit questionable. It sort of veered on that territory of is she really consenting to what he's doing? There are also some other characters who were acting in a similar manner, so I wasn't 100%. And this one, some of those themes continued, but I do feel like there was less of that between Elena and Raphael because their relationship is a lot more established here, and also because of certain events from the first book, they are put on more equal footings. However, there are a lot of other violent elements. We sort of, in the first book, learn a little bit about Elena's past, and this one goes more into depth, and it's rather violent. There are other elements of this that are really violent because we have sort of of these powerful figures like the vampires and the angels who are going a bit rogue and doing things that they shouldn't be doing. The next book that I picked up after that was The Queen's Spade by Sarah Raleigh. So this is a sort of like historical thriller almost that is following Sally Forbes Bonetta, who is one of the adopted godchildren of Queen Victoria. She was basically like a former African princess who was taken into slavery and then rescued by these English ship captains and then brought to England. This was a big part of Queen Victoria's mission of sort of building her benevolent empire, so to speak, where she was very focused on this idea of civilizing savages. Sarah Raleigh went about talking about those issues, was done in a way that it was both informative and age appropriate for the age range. My only sort of complaint about this in terms of its historical representation is the fact that once again Sally is a real person who had a real life and a real story, and I felt like maybe some of the character choices aren't. I do think overall that it was respectful. Like there are these like snippets of like diaries from the actual Sally. However, she adds in this like romance plot line with a character who is like not a historical figure. Sally in real life, she does marry the person she's sort of betrothed to in this book. I feel like that depiction maybe wasn't as respectful of the way that historical marriages worked, and people didn't really choose who they got married to, and a lot of people did end up finding some sort of happiness within those marriages. Obviously there are a lot of examples where that didn't happen. Sarah Raleigh could have approached that with maybe a bit more an understanding for the way that marriage and relationships have been different throughout most of our history. Another aspect is that this is also pitched as like a historical thriller, and we're supposed to be following Sally as she basically is killing everyone who is responsible for enacting the violence against her and being brought to this empire where she has basically been treated as nothing more than a doll to show off Queen Victoria's benevolence. It's sort of similar to Curse of Monte Cristo book that I talked about earlier, that there is a lot of opportunity and depth to those themes, and I feel like it kind of fell short, mainly because of the romance plot lines that were popping up, that it just was sort of distracting away from the actual more important things that were going on. I still overall liked this book, and I think in particular for a YA audience it would appeal to teach them more about history. The next one I have is Strong Female Character by Fern Brady. So this sort of similar to the Unmasking Autism book, a memoir of the Scottish comedian Fern Brady, exploring sort of her early life from the perspective of now understanding that she is autistic. Overall, I really liked this memoir. I would actually recommend this book over Unmasking Autism if you are looking to learn more about, you know, what it's like to live with autism. I thought that her discussion about like her childhood, her teenage years, she talks about like treated poorly by her family, lack of understanding from like her mother in particular, not understanding sort of social cues from other girls in particular, and how as she got older she became more and more ostracized by girls, which is something that is also like my own experience. I really appreciated this memoir. I think there's a lot of important discussions and themes in this, and I honestly don't have anything really like negative to say about it. Also, just an interesting look at someone's life. Brady is a comedian, and so she approaches a lot of these situations with humor that I think can really appeal to a lot of people who might be struggling with similar issues or might be looking to learn more about autism. The next book I have is another Ali Hazelwood book, and it is Defense. This is her most recent release, and overall I really enjoyed this one. Basically, in this one we are following this character named Scarlett, who is a diver at Stanford University, and she is basically sort of unexpectedly thrown into this relationship with Lucas, who is this like pro swimmer. This one is more adult than her other books. There has been both some negative reviews and positive reviews in terms of the content that it talks about. Some people say that it doesn't go far enough, others say that it goes too far. So if you are looking to pick this one up, I would just like being aware of that. She also does have this like snippet at the front where she is addressing that content, which I think is actually good that she's talking about this in like a more mainstream popular romance, because I don't see that there's any reason why we shouldn't discuss these topics. I just think that people should be aware about the content that they are going into, and I think that having that author's note is a good way of mitigating that, because there's been a lot of sort of discussion about like more cartoony covers on spicy romance books, though I do think this one, you can tell it's adult, is all I'm gonna say. But aside from that, there's also a lot of discussion about interesting themes here. Scarlett had recently had this injury that sort of caused this like mental block where she's having trouble with getting back into diving. Scarlett is having to work through this with like a therapist, and I think that inclusion of that was really interesting. And Ellie Hazelwood, I think, has talked about some like issues with like mental health in terms of her other book, and so I think this one sort of goes more in the vein of those books. I also really liked Lucas as the main male character in this. Very charming and very appealing. He does sort of fit in like Ellie Hazelwood's trope of more like stoic male characters. However, I still feel like he's very sweet. I personally, though, would have liked to see more of his character and also more of his character development, because there is sort of this choice that he makes sort of near the end of the book that to me personally didn't really make that much sense, and it's sort of related to the fact that Ellie Hazelwood writes STEM romances, and despite this one having the premise of them both being athletes, she also introduces an element of STEM in this that, while I don't think was bothersome, I don't think was necessary. I actually think that the characters had enough connection just within being student athletes and having like friends in common that it didn't really need that extra STEM component, but I felt like it was sort of foreshadow the choice that Lucas would make at the end. Overall, liked it. I just would have liked to see more of Lucas's character development, but I do think that this marks improvement in Ellie Hazelwood's writing in general, and I can't wait to read more from her. Love her writing. I still think Love Theoretically is like my favorite, and honestly, now that I've read 2 of her books this year, I honestly really want to reread Love Theoretically. However, I do think that the sequel to Bride is coming out, which is called Mate, this year, and I'm so excited for that one because Bride ended up on like a cliffhanger and I kind of like guessed it, so I'm really excited for that one. The next book I picked up was Emily Wilde's Compendium of Lost Tales, which is the 3rd and potentially final book in the Emily Wilde series. I'm not 100% sure if it's the final book, because after reading this, I don't really feel like it had wrapped up the plotline. Overall, this one is my least favorite in the series. I loved the first book and loved the second book. The second book I actually liked more than the first book. I thought that it had a better balance between the plotline and the romance. This one, on the other hand, almost no romance in it, and the plotline was sort of a bit different. I still think it was sort of consistent with the development that we saw in the first and second ones. I wasn't as keen on some of the choices that Emily was making. I felt like she was being a bit, maybe stupid. Maybe that's a bit harsh, but in a lot of the other books there was a lot of like exploring and like discovering new things and like uncovering secrets and whatnot. And we also had a bit bigger of an ensemble cast in terms of like, in the first one we had Emily, and then there were the locals in the town that she was like sort of struggling to get to know, and then there was Wendell on top of that. And then in the second one we have Emily and Wendell building on their relationship, but we also get sort of this team of scholars that they're like working with, and I kind of like that push and pull dynamic of having those closer circles of people. And in this one we sort of get that feel like the other characters that we're now introduced to are so distant from the actual happenings. I don't feel like the connection was there the same way, and then also there were elements where Wendell and Emily's relationship wasn't really developed anymore, so, and sadly I was disappointed with this, and I hope that maybe we get a book 4, or maybe we get like a spin-off in the same world and same series, because I love the world, I love the fairy aspect, I love the like scholarly sort of light academia vibe going on, and I am really gonna, if this is the end of the series, I am gonna really miss it. So I'm disappointed in this one, and it's a very sad 3-star coming down from a 5-star. And the disappointments don't end there, because our next book, also a conclusion to the series, is Rebel Witch. Kind of dramatic, but honestly, I hated this book. I felt like that the author was ticking off check boxes on a tropes list and was not actually writing a story. First book in this series, while it had a lot of these trope elements, like there was enemies to lovers, there was like bantering, and it was still done in a way where it felt like a cohesive narrative, whereas this just felt like trope after trope after trope. It was like enemies to lovers, only one bad, touch her and die, and stuff like that. I felt like it was one of those Instagram posts where they post the cover of the book and then they put like the trope, which I don't necessarily think is a completely a bad thing, but I think when you're just writing a book for the sake of like what you perceive could be most marketable social media wise is bad. And I don't know if that was intention behind this, but that's how it felt to me. It very much felt like it was writing to that book talk and booktube audience that this book got popular from, instead of actually trying to tell a cohesive and coherent narrative. I think my main issue was how stupid the characters were acting, because I actually felt like in the first one that both Rune and Gideon were very conniving, and that was completely absent in this book. And same with the villains, and I just felt like they were making these really stupid decisions. This one particular character who makes the dumbest decisions ever, and I can't talk about them without spoiling this book, but there is this one character that is on the villain side that just makes so many dumb choices, and I literally do not understand why that character made those choices, because if they didn't, the entire book would have gone differently. So just the entire premise of like the action and the like threat in this book just made no sense to me. Yeah, overall disappointed in this. I also think the ending was really lackluster. I think that the romance was poorly developed. I personally think that this probably could have actually been a trilogy as opposed to a duology, and that might have actually fixed some of the issues, because the author could have gone a bit more in depth with some of the themes that I felt were lacking. So that might have helped it, but in general, disappointing. Is Dating and Dragon, the follow-up book to Dungeons and Drama. So this one, basically our female character, Quinn, has moved to this new town, and she has recently had this falling out with her former best friend. So she is moving to this new town, struggling to find her place. By chance, she actually encounters this group of people who play D&D, and she loves D&D, and so she's really excited to get to know them, and then she gets invited to play the game with them. However, when she gets there, she finds out that they actually live stream their games, and on top of that, that they have this rule where no one who is in the game can have romantic relationships with each other, because they want to keep their team as like steady as possible. And at first this really isn't a problem for Quinn. She kind of wants to stay away from romantic relationships. However, she encounters Logan. They sort of almost immediately sort of hit it off. They have a bit of like a flirty banter going on. Logan kind of starts acting a bit mean to her, because he sort of doesn't want her to join, because he wants to be in a relationship. There are some like other themes outside of the romance, and I have heard some like criticism from others that were saying that the romance was a bit childish, which I actually think is a good thing, because it is a YA series. So I think having these characters and acting in these more childlike manners is actually better, because it's more suited for how like a teenager would perceive themselves in this situation. And it also made sense for Quinn's character because of the past experience she has that was negative with her old friends. There's also a theme. Quinn's grandmother is also older and is sort of struggling with some health issues. She's a rather funny character, and I quite enjoyed her, but it also explores how it feels to watch your family members sort of change as they age. Quinn's perspective and sort of the complications that can arise. So it's sort of like hard to navigate those changes, and also knowing that more changes are to come. That this book does that in a very tasteful way that is approachable for younger readers. And I also like the friendship aspect of it too, because there's like another girl character who she sort of forms the friendship with in the first place, and I really liked seeing their friendship develop, especially because Quinn has lost their former best friend. So my last book is another one that I have a bit of mixed feelings, and that is Wild Seed by Octavia E. Butler. So Octavia E. Butler is sort of classic pinnacle authors in the science fiction genre. I think the themes in this were really interesting. However, I feel like with a lot of books that are trying to discuss important subjects, they sometimes sacrifice the narrative of the story that they're trying to tell to emphasize more of the thematic issue. And I think that this book does so. Following these two immortals in a way like bound together by, we call it love. It says that it's love on the back. It says, in an epic story of love and hate, two immortals chase each other across continents and centuries, binding their fates together and changing the destiny of the human race. I don't think this is love. I think it's more of like these toxic, abusive dynamics and relationships. I don't think there's any element of love. I don't even know if the male character in this is even someone who is capable of love, domineering person, and that is done representative of systems of power that have continuously abused people. It's sort of similar to that. There is a lot of discussion about different forms of historic violence, so sort of similar to the Queen's Spade. There's a lot of discussion about slavery, and eugenics in particular is a big thing, because they are these like two immortals who have these powers. So the man, his name is Doro, he is sort of like establishing this like community where he is forcing people to have children together so that they produce ones that are more valuable. And Yanwu, who is our female character, is one of those people that is sort of forced into this community after Doro finds her. Doro's views and what he wants ends up taking over her life and ends up informing almost every single decision that she ends up making, because she's sort of forced into a situation where she's not allowed to make any decisions for herself and has to accord to any and all beliefs that he does. There is a lot of interesting exploration of things of violence, and also Doro sort of hops between bodies, and Yanwu as a shapeshifter. The aspect that they are constantly changing their bodies brings up a lot of interesting conversations. The first one is about gender and sexuality, because both of them, Doro uses he, him pronouns, Yanwu uses she, her pronouns, even though they can take the shape of different genders. So I thought that was kind of interesting in terms of talking about like how gender is more of an internal thing than an external thing, which I think is a really progressive conversation to be having at the time that this book was written. I think that Doro's sort of like body changing aspect is also indicative of how cultures of violence and oppressors are always changing, but violence itself always exists within our societies. And I think that this book does a really good job at showing that, in particular by sort of drawing this parallel between Doro's actions and the actions of slaveholders, because similar to what Doro is doing, slaveholders also had the same power to manipulate who would marry who and who would have children with who. So overall, I think the themes and discussions are really interesting in this, but I do believe that it was sacrificed for the sake of narrative, and so I don't really think it's that compelling as an actual story. I do think it has a lot of compelling elements in terms of the themes and discussions it brings up. That is actually the last of the books that I have here. So thank you so much for listening to this video and listening to me ramble for these books, and hopefully this maybe inspires you to pick up some of these books, and I'd love to hear what books you have read so far this year as well. Thank you once again for watching this, and I hope you had a good time and enjoyed listening to me talk about these books, and